They came with bolt cutters at sunrise and tore down the one thing my father built with his own 2 hands before he died. They thought it was just an old fence. They had no idea what was buried at the corner post. By the time I was done, that rusted piece of iron they never noticed cost the HOA $375,000 and ended 3 people's careers. If you think you've seen HOA cruelty before, wait until you hear what they destroyed to get to that fence. Subscribe now, because this one is personal. My father built that fence the summer before he was diagnosed. Cedar posts, hand-strung wire, corners reinforced with iron stakes he salvaged from an old railway yard. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even perfectly straight, but every single post held a memory. Weekends we spent together, the last real project we ever finished as father and son. He passed 18 months later. I inherited the house, the land, and that fence. To me, it wasn't a boundary. It was the last thing my father ever built. The HOA saw it differently. A new board president, a man named Preston Vance, decided the fence violated a uniform perimeter aesthetic clause buried in a bylaw amendment from years earlier, one nobody in the neighborhood had ever enforced, because nobody's fence had ever looked quite like mine. I got the first letter 3 weeks after Vance took office, then a second, then a final notice citing daily fines if I didn't remove it myself within 30 days. I appealed. I explained the fence's history. I even offered to repaint it to match community standards. Vance's response was cold. Sentimental value doesn't override covenant compliance. I told him I needed more time. He told me time was up. On a grey Tuesday morning, I woke to the sound of metal grinding against metal. I ran outside in my socks to find 2 HOA-hired workers using industrial bolt cutters on my father's fence. Hyle Preston Vance stood at the property line, arms crossed, watching like he was overseeing a routine cleanup. "You can't do this," I shouted. "This is private property." "The board authorized removal of non-compliant structures," he said, not even looking at me. "You were notified." I watched, helpless, as section after section of that fence, every post my father had sunk into the ground with his own hands, was ripped out and thrown into a dumpster like scrap metal. When they reached the northeast corner post, one of the workers suddenly stopped, staring down at something half buried near the base. "Hey," he called out to his partner. "There's something under this one. Looks old." Vance walked over, annoyed, clearly wanting this finished. But when he crouched down and saw what the worker was pointing at, his expression changed completely. Buried at the base of that corner post was a rusted iron survey marker, one that didn't belong to my property records at all. Vance's face shifted from irritation to something colder. Recognition. "Stop," he said sharply to the workers. "Don't touch that." But it was too late for pretending nothing was happening. I'd already seen it. I pushed past him and knelt beside the corner post myself, brushing away decades of dirt and rust with my fingers. It was a surveyor's iron pin, thick, corroded, hammered deep into the ground long before the HOA even existed. Stamped faintly into its rounded cap were numbers I could barely make out, a year and a set of initials. "What is this?" I demanded. "It's nothing," Vance said quickly. "Some old junk from before the development. Finish the removal." Something about the way he said finish made my stomach turn. He wasn't confused. He was rattled. I stopped the workers myself. "Nobody touches this until I find out what it is." Vance tried to argue jurisdiction, tried to cite bylaws, tried to talk over me. But for the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't backing down. I photographed the marker from every angle before he could stop me, then called the one person I trusted to make sense of it. My Aunt Carol, a retired title examiner who'd spent 30 years reading property records for a living. She arrived within the hour, took one look at the photos, and went pale. "That's a federal-era boundary marker," she said. Pre-development. These were placed by licensed surveyors decades before subdivisions like this one even existed, and they're legally protected. Moving or destroying one without authorization isn't just a property violation. What is it then? It's a criminal offense, she said, and if that marker sits where I think it does, it means the entire property line this HOA has been operating under for years is wrong. My pulse spiked. Wrong how? Carol pulled out her phone, cross-referencing county archives right there, in my driveway. Her face grew more serious with every scroll. Your father's fence wasn't encroaching on HOA land, she said slowly. According to this marker, the HOA's common area has been encroaching on your land for at least 40 years. I stared at her, stunned. That can't be right. It gets worse, she said, looking up at me with an expression I'll never forget. Because if this marker is authentic, the HOA didn't just illegally destroy your father's fence. They illegally destroyed federally protected evidence of a boundary they already knew was wrong. The words hit me like a wave. They already knew. How would they have known? I asked. Carol was already pulling up something else on her phone, an old HOA meeting archive she'd found through a public records portal. Because, she said, HOAs are required to disclose known boundary disputes during annual meetings if they're documented anywhere in board records. Let me check something. 10 minutes later, she found it, buried in the minutes from an HOA meeting held 9 years earlier, long before Preston Vance ever took office. A single paragraph, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. A survey discrepancy was noted along the northeast property boundary shared with the Whitmore residents. The board recommends deferring resolution to avoid legal costs. Whitmore, my father's last name. They'd known. 9 years ago, an entirely different HOA board had discovered this exact discrepancy, and instead of fixing it, or even telling my father, they'd buried it in a meeting nobody outside the board ever read. My father spent the rest of his life believing that Fence sat entirely on his own land. He never knew the HOA had quietly acknowledged in writing that the true boundary favoured him, and then said nothing, hoping it would never come up again. Until Preston Vance tore down the fence trying to erase what little evidence remained. I called an attorney that same night, a boundary and property rights specialist named Diane Kessler, who'd handled cases involving federal survey markers before. I sent her everything, the photos, Carol's findings, the archived meeting minutes. Her response, delivered in a calm but deadly serious tone, changed the entire trajectory of this fight. This isn't a fence dispute anymore, she said. This is destruction of a federally protected boundary monument, concealment of a known property discrepancy for nearly a decade, and unauthorized removal of a private structure built on land that was never legally theirs to regulate. What does that mean for Vance? I asked. It means, Diane said, Preston Vance just personally authorized the destruction of evidence in an active, if previously dormant, boundary dispute. And depending on what the county surveyor finds when they re-examine that marker, she paused. He may have just made himself personally, financially liable. Not just the HOA. Him. 2 days later, county surveyors arrived to formally document the marker's location before it could be disturbed further. As they worked, a black car I didn't recognize slowly pulled up along the curb, and the man who stepped out wasn't Preston Vance. It was someone representing the HOA's insurance carrier, and he didn't look happy. The insurance representative introduced himself as Warren Pruitt, an adjuster sent to assess the HOA's liability exposure before things went any further. He didn't shake my hand. He didn't even make eye contact with Preston Vance, who trailed a few steps behind him, visibly smaller than the man who'd stood over my father's dismantled fence with such confidence days earlier. We're aware of the boundary marker discovery, Pruitt said flatly. The board would like to resolve this matter efficiently. Efficiently, I repeated. Is that what you call tearing down my father's fence and hiding a known property dispute for 9 years? Pruitt didn't answer that. Instead, he slid a folder toward me. The HOA is prepared to offer $40,000 for the incident, contingent on your agreement to drop any further claims and sign a non-disclosure regarding the boundary discrepancy. $40,000. To make my father's memory disappear quietly, along with a decade of concealed HOA misconduct. I looked at Vance, who still hadn't said a word. You knew about this the whole time, didn't you? Not just the fence, the letter in those meeting minutes? His jaw tightened. That was before my time on the board. But you found out, I said. That day, at the corner post. You recognized that marker immediately. You told them to stop working, not because you cared about evidence, because you knew exactly what it meant. He said nothing, which, somehow, said everything. I declined the offer on the spot. Diane, my attorney, later told me it was the right call, because the moment I found that marker and the buried meeting minutes, this stopped being a private settlement and became something county surveyors and eventually a judge would need to rule on publicly. 3 weeks later, the official county survey results came back. Carroll's read of the marker was correct, the true bound. Aries shifted the HOA's claimed common area a full 11 feet onto what had always legally been my father's land, the exact strip where his fence had stood. Diane filed a formal complaint. Destruction of a protected federal boundary monument, unauthorized removal of a lawfully placed private structure, and concealment of a known property dispute, the last charge naming both the HOA as an entity and Preston Vance personally, based on his conduct at the scene. The case moved faster than anyone expected. The HOA's insurance carrier, terrified of a public trial exposing a decade-long cover-up, pushed hard for a settlement. But this time, I wasn't the only one they had to answer to. Because 2 days before our scheduled hearing, Diane received a call from a state surveying board investigator. Word of the marker's destruction had reached them independently, and they had questions of their own. Questions that would turn a private property dispute into something much bigger than money. The investigator's name was Michael Torres, an official with the state's Board of Professional Land Surveyors, an agency I didn't even know existed until 3 days before our hearing. He requested a meeting with Diane and me at her office, and what he told us changed the entire shape of this case. Federal and state-recognized boundary markers are protected under specific statutes, Torres explained. Unauthorized destruction isn't just a civil matter between you and the HOA. It's a regulatory violation that can trigger independent state penalties, separate from anything a judge awards you personally. Separate how? I asked. The HOA's landscaping crew destroyed a documented survey monument while performing HOA-authorized work, Torres said. That makes the HOA administratively liable to the state, on top of whatever civil damages you're pursuing. And given the 9-year-old meeting minutes proving they knew about the discrepancy beforehand, he paused, choosing his words carefully. This isn't just negligence. This looks like willful concealment, followed by willful destruction of evidence. That combination triggers the maximum penalty tier. Our hearing, originally expected to be a straightforward property dispute, suddenly had 2 separate legal tracks converging on the same courtroom. My civil case against the HOA and Preston Vance personally, and a state regulatory penalty tied directly to the destroyed marker. When the hearing finally began, Judge Renata Alvarez, known throughout the county for her meticulous, almost surgical handling of property law cases, reviewed every piece of evidence in near silence. The county survey results, Carroll's original photographs, the 9-year-old buried meeting minutes, Torres's regulatory findings, and finally security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera that Diane had subpoenaed, footage that clearly howled Preston Vance, ordering the crew to hurry up and finish the moment he recognized the marker, before quickly correcting himself in front of me. The footage did more damage to Vance than anything else. It proved intent. Judge Alvarez looked up from the documents, her expression unreadable, and addressed the HOA's attorney directly. Your client's board possessed documented knowledge of this boundary discrepancy for 9 years and chose concealment over resolution, she said. When the physical evidence of that discrepancy was finally uncovered, your client's current president ordered the crew to continue destroying it, then attempted to disguise his reaction in front of the property owner. That is not negligence. That is consciousness of guilt. The courtroom went utterly silent. "This court," she continued, "finds in full favor of the plaintiff on all counts." The final judgment: $375,000 in combined civil damages, restitution, and regulatory penalties, a number that accounted for the destroyed federal marker, the concealed 9-year-old discrepancy, punitive damages for willful destruction of evidence, and compensation for the loss of a structure with irreplaceable personal significance. Preston Vance was held personally liable for a portion of the judgment, separate from the HOA's insurance coverage, a detail Diane told me almost never happens unless a judge believes someone crossed the line from board decision into personal misconduct. But as the gavel came down, Vance turned to me one final time, his expression unreadable. And what he said next wasn't an apology. It was something far stranger, something that told me this story wasn't quite finished yet. "You have no idea what you just started," Vance said quietly, before the bailiff moved him along. I didn't understand what he meant. Not that day. 3 weeks later, I found out. Michael Torres called me directly this time, not Diane. "The regulatory investigation into your case triggered something bigger," he said. "Once we flagged the destroyed marker and the concealment pattern, we cross-referenced it against a statewide database of boundary disputes tied to HOA-managed properties. And your case wasn't isolated," he said. "We found 4 other HOA communities in the county with nearly identical patterns, undisclosed boundary discrepancies buried in old meeting minutes, involving the same regional property management company that once oversaw your father's HOA before it went independent." My stomach turned. So this wasn't just Vance. This wasn't just one HOA. "It might be systemic," Torres said. "And your case just became the reason we're reopening all of them." Preston Vance resigned from the board within days of the ruling, though resigned barely covers it. The remaining board members forced him out before the ink on the judgment even dried, desperate to distance themselves from a case that was quickly becoming county-wide news. I used part of the settlement to do something I'd wanted to do since the day they tore the fence down. I rebuilt it. Same cedar-toned posts, same rough, imperfect lines my father originally planned, following the newly corrected boundary that finally, officially, belonged to no one but our family. At the northeast corner, I didn't just rebury that rusted iron marker. I had it professionally restored, encased in a small protective glass marker box, with a plaque beneath it that reads simply, "Some lines aren't meant to be erased." My father never got to see the truth come out. He spent his final years believing a boundary dispute might exist, quietly worried, never able to prove it. I like to think that somewhere he knows it's settled now. Not just settled, but decisively, publicly, in his family's favor. Because here's what this entire nightmare taught me. HOAs can write bylaws. They can vote on aesthetics. They can send letters and threaten fines. But they cannot erase the truth buried in the ground. And they cannot outrun what happens when someone finally digs it up. Preston Vance tried to tear down a fence to make a problem disappear. Instead, he dug up a truth that ended his career, exposed a county-wide pattern of HOA corruption, and cost them all $375,000, starting with one rusted piece of iron nobody was ever supposed to find. If this story kept you hooked until the very end, imagine how many other HOA boundary disputes are sitting quietly in old meeting minutes right now, waiting to be found. Subscribe now, because the next discovery might expose an entire county